Let's see. Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thanks for coming. I know it's holidays and all and Friday, but at least so today's talk is on predicting modeling using large cluster data sets by Thomas Debray, who's coming from the Julius Center of Health Sciences and Primary Care in the Netherlands. And it sounds like a really interesting topic, so looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. So this is basically where I work in Utrecht, so just to give a short indication. So today I want to give a short talk on the development and validation of prediction models, which are used for predicting certain outcomes. And I will start with an introduction on the use and development of these type of models. And then I will move on typical problems with these type of prediction models and what causes these problems. And then I would like to go into some major opportunities that may help to develop better prediction models and opportunities that are especially present since quite recent. So as many of you may already be familiar with prediction models, well, the aim of these models is really to predict something that we don't know, and that can either be something at the present, so like a diagnosis of a certain condition, but often also it can be about the future, like predicting mortality risk or presence of cardiovascular disease or any other type of outcomes in the future. And often these predictions are used for deciding on patient management, to decide whether a certain patient should be referred for further testing or for a more riskful type of testing, or perhaps to inform the patient and their families about how to what they should expect about the future. And increasingly often these models are also used to guide treatment strategies, to assess the risk of, for instance, dying from a certain condition if they are left untreated, and how that risk might improve or deteriorate by considering a certain treatment. And so the aim of these prediction models is really to provide individualized information, individualized care, and so to really for each individual to give a personal risk of developing or having a certain condition. And so we typically use statistical probabilities, so probabilities that indicate the risk that some event might happen. And this is just some illustration of how to interpret these probabilities. For instance, here on this graph or this image, you see, for instance, the risk of developing cancer, which is about 400,000 in 1 million. And you have other risks as well. For instance, dying from cancer, it's a lot lower risk. And of course, depending on how you will be treated, it will also change as well. And so, it all comes back. So the question is really how can we make this type of predictions? And so in the past, when people weren't really familiar with statistics and prediction modeling, it would be more based on experience and cases that they've seen in the past, and based on that, they would make some inferring on what they might expect in the future for this type of patients. And so what people would look at are things like subject characteristics like age and gender, etc. Because, for instance, the older you are, the higher the risk of dying of a certain condition. But this could be also more refined information like history of physical examination and test results like blood pressure measurements, or even imaging results, a CT scan. And since recently also in cardiovascular disease, we use a lot of biomarkers. So this kind of blood test where they measure a plaque or cell count of something, and then those results can also give a good indication of a certain risk of developing cardiovascular disease or dying from a certain event. And so the real idea is to really combine all this subject level information from multiple sources, like it's the gender of the patient and his age and his blood pressure measurements, etc., to combine all this information into one probability statement about the outcome you're trying to predict. And so that's why we typically talk about multivariable models, because we try to combine multiple variables and multiple predictors. And so, of course, to do that, we need to collect data, and that's where the whole epidemiology comes in, because we need to set up cohort studies and collect data of relevant patients and follow them up and observe their outcomes. And only as soon as we have those data, we can use it to develop all these models. And so, for developing these prediction models, there are many strategies. Some of you may be familiar with. So, regression is very typical. But there are many other strategies, so like decision trees, I think, have been quite common in the past, because they are very interpretable. They don't give you an equation, but it's just like some kind of step procedure that you can follow. But recently you also have more machine learning type of methods like neural networks and support vector machines and things like that. But I will come back later. So some typical examples of prediction models. So this is a prediction model to predict breast cancer incidence with women mostly. And you can see, so this is made available on the web. So in the background is some kind of mathematical equation, but what you see is basically all the predictors, we call them, so all the variables that are used for making that prediction. So they ask about, in this case, about medical history of carcinoma, probably the age as well, and they ask many predictors, and they combine that into a probability statement. This is another example which is quite famous. This is a score model. So this is another way of presenting a risk prediction model. And so here it's a bit more visual, you know, well, basically you can, you know, for any patient presenting themselves at primary care, you can, you know, figure out is men or women, is she smoking, yes or no, and depending on that, you will end up in one of these, you know, in these colored areas. And for instance, let's say we have a woman who's a smoker and has a blood pressure of 180, so we get a score of, in this case, let's say 15. So that would be a risk of 15% of developing cardiovascular disease in the next 10 years. And so, yeah, so why, you might wonder, why do we want to use these prediction models? Well, they're actually becoming really popular, and especially in cardiovascular disease, so we did some reviews as well. So there's hundreds of these models, so everyone wants to develop these models because, you know, they facilitate really a lot understanding of risk because they formalize the whole process of risk assessment. And on top of that, many people like to develop them because it makes you famous, developing all these models. Because you get a name, you can put your name on the model, and then people start using it, and you can, you know, people are developing it. And so you can see that over time, so, well, we started in the 1990s, 2012, and now we're even much farther. But you can see that the number of these models is increasing really fast. And so what's really important of all these prediction models, because it's nice to develop all these models, but what's the point if they're not useful, if they're not, you know, making a change in patient care? And so what we really consider really important for all these prediction models is that they yield a positive impact into patient care, so that they really improve patient outcomes by using those models. And how do we achieve this positive impact? Well, first of all, we need to be sure that these predictions that the models provide, so if prediction model says for me that I have 5% of developing cardiovascular disease in the next 10 years, that 5% is really accurate. So it really means 5% and not 20% or 1%. Because, you know, I might make important decisions based on that percentage that may have substantial impact on my life. What's also important is discrimination. That basically means that a model can distinguish well between people who will develop the event and who will not develop the event. So it's of course related to calibration, but discrimination is really about separating people. So it's about being able to distinguish between, you know, low risk and higher risk patients. And then besides those two components, it's also really important that prediction models have some sense of generality, so that when we develop a model in a certain setting, so when I collect some data in Utrecht in primary care patients, that the usefulness of this model is not restricted to just those patients in Utrecht in primary care, but that to some extent we can use that model that I developed in Utrecht, that we can maybe use it somewhere else in the Netherlands, or maybe somewhere else in Europe. There will of course be some limitation, you know, to how far you can extrapolate this model, but at least you want to have some sense of generality, because otherwise the usefulness will be very limited of these models, and, you know, everyone will just keep continuing models with very little applicability. And the final aspect is that it's really important that even when models are really accurate and really generalizable, etc., so when they're really reliable, it doesn't have any usefulness when nobody wants to use these models. So that's also really important that, well, I give the name support, but that people are willing to use these models in clinical practice, and also that they are actually usable. For instance, if you have prediction models that use all these kind of expensive biomarkers to make predictions, it will maybe be very accurate, but it will not have great applicability, because to make that prediction you will have to measure all these expensive markers and all these maybe expensive procedures, and so it might have very limited usefulness nevertheless. So basically, to have well, applicable and useful prediction models, we need to consider much more than just its predictive accuracy, but also its extent that it can be used across settings, and also its usability. And so for that, to acknowledge all these components, well, we've come up with a lot of phases in prediction modeling research. I will not go into much detail today in that. So today, rather, I want to talk about some typical problems with prediction models. And I think so. One of the most important problems is that, so as I mentioned, so many researchers like to develop all these prediction models, and so they collect, or they happen to have some data at their center from registry data or whatever, and they see this data and they see, oh, I haven't developed a model yet with my data. So they develop a model and they publish it, and people forget about it, and maybe some of them will validate it. But anyway, what we have seen a lot is that many of these prediction modeling studies are prone to quite poor methodological standards. So often you might have something like missing data, or the way how data were collected. There's often quite important issues with these things. But even if there were no issues, you will often find that the way how people report how they develop that model is quite poor. And sometimes they might even develop a model and not give you the model, so you might not even use it. You might not even be able to use it. So they just have a paper that describes, we developed this really nice prediction model. We applied it in our patients, it worked very well. There you go. But so for new people to use it is not always straightforward. And so that really limits the reproducibility of this study. So we cannot really check what they did is correct and to what extent it works. And often what happens is that actually they also, there's some extent of overfitting. So the limited data that they have, they try to, or maybe not they try not to do it, but what happens often is that they overinterpret the data. So they make prediction models that are too tailored to that particular data set. So how is this illustrated? For instance, here you can see in this graph that if you have some data points, well, let's just say for simplicity that horizontal axis you have something like blood, no, let's say what we have age, and on the y-axis blood pressure or something like that. And what happens with overfitting is that, well, you look too closely to the data, and so you will predict. You'll end up with predictive patterns that are very unreliable and very inconsistent, and basically when you use that model in new patients, it will not be accurate. And a more important problem is that many of these prediction models do not transport very well. So when we apply them to new patients, to new settings, the predictions are quite poor. And so this is, I think, a review that was done in 2014. So they looked at many published prediction models, and they looked for those models that have been externally validated. So where they used the prediction model and then they applied it into new patients, and they measured the predictive performance. And so for most of these studies that they found, they saw that the predictive performance in the original data, so where the model was developed, was often a lot higher than when the model was applied again in some new patients. So often, basically, what happens is that when some researchers develop a prediction model and then it's being used by other people, the performance that you will get from that model, most of the time it will deteriorate. It will be worse in patients in new settings. Most of the time it will always be worse than originally anticipated or reported. And so this really limits the usefulness of all these prediction models. And so this drop in performance, or this deterioration of predictive performance, can occur due to many different reasons. And so one of the reasons, well, people often like to mention is that this model is useful, but they didn't consider this and this and this predictor, which we know that is maybe a causal relationship on the outcome, and it's really important. Sometimes it's about interaction terms, like genomic interaction or interaction between multiple predictors that are not model in the model, and that may basically limit the usefulness of this model to different patients or settings. There might be nonlinear trends, so for like smoking, no, not smoking, but like age, or especially I think with blood cell counts or things like that, which are highly, they can be highly nonlinear in terms of the data. But I think even more often than not, we have issues with the measurement of predictors. So the way how they are measured, it's often, there can be a lot of difference in quality and in standards, especially when you deal with healthcare practitioners who don't have much time. They are not going to take, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes to take a simple measurement, which they don't care too much about the exact value of these measures. And also the issue that we see a lot with prediction modeling studies is that the modeling choices or strategies are often quite poor. So what often happens is that for continuous covariates, they would categorize the data. So they would say, like, instead of using age as a continuous predictor, they would make some kind of categories, age lower than 20, somewhere between 20 and 50, and older than 50. And so that really reduces in a lot of information and may really deteriorate your prediction model performance. Now, besides these components, there are also many other reasons why prediction models may not perform very well in new settings. One of the reasons is there may be important differences in patient spectra. So when we develop a prediction model in primary care patients and we try to apply it in secondary care patients, it will be much more difficult to get that predictive accuracy in those secondary care patients, especially in terms of discrimination, because they look much more similar. So if we can distinguish between who will die from cardiovascular disease and who will survive in primary care, if we can do that pretty well, still, when we move on to secondary care with all patients who just underwent cardiac surgery, it will be much more difficult to have that same discriminative ability, because they all look much more similar. They're already high-risk patients, who are just getting cardiovascular disease, so distinguishing between those high-risk patients will be more difficult. There are also differences in standards of care, which is also related to patient spectrum, basically. But to give an example, so if we are dealing with patients in a high-income country, they typically have access to much better healthcare than in other countries, and that might also have an impact on their prognosis, unless, of course, you account for these factors in your prediction model. But none of these models is perfect. And then the final aspect is that so most of these prediction models, so many people develop them, but most of these models are never validated. So for most of the developed prediction models, we actually don't know how good they are, how reliable they are. They're just out there, and we can try to use them, but it's always a gamble. And so basically, I would like to say, so well, most of the models are not as good as we think, or as we would like to think, and most of the time we will not even know it because there's no validation of these models. And the key issue is that there is often poor quality of primary prognostic studies. So the reporting, but also the conduct, is quite poor, although it's improving. There have been some guidelines in this area. Many prediction models have poor reproducibility, so there's overfitting, and they're too complex. They're too complex for the data that allow them, and they have poor transportability. So they do not apply very well from setting to setting. So maybe they give you very accurate predictions in the same hospital, but as soon as you start using the model in a new hospital, in a new region, it's not reliable anymore. And the final problem is indeed so the lack of external validation. So most of these models have never been tested for their predictive accuracy. So there is one statement that's really famous in prediction modeling research, so all models are wrong, which is definitely the case, but some are useful. And the question is really, which one of all these prediction models are useful, and also to what extent are they useful? So which of these models, to what extent can I rely on their predictions, and can I not rely on them? And so for that, to be aware of that, we really need to put more emphasis on this external validation aspect. And so as I mentioned, so this is not the end. So we know that there are all these problems with prediction models, but still people like to continue developing new models. These are some examples. But we did a very recent review for models for cardiovascular disease. So it's even much more than 150. I think we've got to a number of 300-something prediction models. So just more than hundreds and hundreds of models for just predicting cardiovascular disease, which is a lot. So if I am interested to predict cardiovascular disease, I have to figure out, which of all these hundreds and hundreds of models should I be using in my patients. Or maybe, I happen to have a data set of 200 patients, maybe I should just develop my own model for predicting cardiovascular disease. And that's what happens most of the time. So you can imagine how it goes. And so there have been a lot of people have come up with some statements and recommendations, but the essence is that I think it's widely agreed now that we should put more efforts and time into evaluating, all these models that are out there, which ones are actually reliable, and we should try to compare them head to head like we do with interventions, because to some extent the prediction model can be seen as an intervention because we use these models in clinical practice to make decisions, and these decisions have an impact on patient outcomes. At least we hope that's the case. And so basically we really need to know which of these models are reliable and to what extent they're reliable, and whether or not they need further improvements in local settings. And so this brings me to three areas of opportunities I would like to discuss. And the first one relates to evidence synthesis. So that's really a topic that has been raised a lot over the past few decades, I would say, and is quite a central theme now in intervention research. So when we talk about medical interventions, So there is the Cochrane collaboration, but there's many other organizations as well who now want to make decisions on the recommendations of certain interventions, but also on reimbursement and things like that. They want to have all the relevant evidence as possible. And so how can we use this paradigm of evidence synthesis, of taking all the studies that investigated a certain medical intervention, or in this case a certain prediction model, how can we use all that knowledge from all these different studies that have been published somewhere to summarize all this information and to get a better understanding of which prediction models are useful for our patients and to what extent they should be improved. And so the idea of evidence synthesis in prediction modeling is to, first of all, to make better prediction models. So if we are developing a new prediction model, by considering what other people have done in the past, it can inform us in the development of these models, and we can make more reliable models because we can build on the knowledge of previous studies. But we can also use evidence synthesis to evaluate sources of variability in predictive performance. So we can try to understand, in the past all these people have developed these prediction models, and some of them didn't work very well. Why was that the case? Why were there problems with these prediction models? And if we understand that, we can improve our own model by accounting for it. And we can also better understand to what extent existing prediction models will apply well to our patients, and if not, what kind of improvements of these models should be pursued. And there's different type of synthesis that we can consider. So we can focus synthesis on prognostic factors. So that's basically studies that look at individual associations between a certain marker and an outcome. Like we have the CYMT, I forgot what it stands for, but it's a measurement in the blood where they count something, they do a certain cell count, and they can, that amount of cell count gives you an indication, or it's very strongly related to cardiovascular disease in the future. And so, but for many of these prognostic factors, some of these studies are very simple. They would just measure the association between, let's say, even just gender, differences in mortality between gender. And we know in cardiovascular disease, the prognosis of cardiovascular patients is quite different in males and in females, and that's why often you have different models for males and for females. But that's just one example. You have many of these prognostic factors for which there are studies out there, and so if you would consider all these studies that have been conducted, for instance, in cardiovascular disease, it would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, all giving you information about to what extent gender has a role in the prognosis of cardiovascular disease, and age, and blood pressure, etc., etc. So all these studies and all this information can give you much more refined information about prediction of individual patients. A more complex form of evidence synthesis relates to prediction models. So we can, all these hundreds of prediction models that are out there for predicting breast cancer, predicting cardiovascular disease, they all give you some piece of, of the larger body of evidence about how prognosis in these patients occurs. And so we could somehow combine all these prediction models in the development of a new prediction model. And finally, we can consider synthesis of prediction model performance, and that's more specific to situations where you have well-known prediction models like a Framingham or SCORE that have been validated many, many times. And all these validations can, by summarizing their information, we can get a better understanding why this Framingham model or this SCORE model works well in some patients and works worse in different types of patients. And so these are just some publications, but the main idea is that, so if you want to combine evidence on prognostic factors, we can basically apply meta-analysis principles on their associations and use those summary estimates, summary associations, to inform associations in our own population. And then the other idea was that we can do is combine existing prediction models, and that's really useful when we want to predict a certain condition in a certain population, and we have data from our population, but often the data that we have in our setting is often limited, right? We work in a certain hospital on a certain practice, and we have some data from our own patients, so we've maybe done an observational study with, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 patients. So that's can be, quite laborious, and it takes quite a lot of time and effort to collect this data, and it will often be relatively limited in terms of size, because it's so, time-consuming and expensive to do all these studies. And so what we can do is to use our data and combine it with all the previously published prediction models for the condition we are interested in, and to use, by combining this data basically, we can come up with a more reliable prediction model than just using our data and developing a new model. So basically we can combine existing models and tailor it to our own population. And so we illustrated this idea with, I think, a diagnosis of deep vein thrombosis. So for deep vein thrombosis there are probably more, but we found 5 prediction models that predict the presence of deep vein thrombosis in patients with, where it is suspected that they might have some thrombosis. And these models are, I think it's the Wells rule, maybe some of you know it. Modified Wells, and there are some other models as well, and one of them was developed in the Netherlands. And so if I work in a primary care setting and I want to predict, I have a patient and I suspect that they have deep vein thrombosis, and I want to assess the risk of that the patient has a disease, I could use, one of these 5 different rules. I happen to have my own data set, so I could develop my own model for predicting the risk of deep vein thrombosis. Or I could actually combine all these 5 models that have been developed in the past. So, I could combine all these previously published models with my own data to come up with predictions that are informed by all these previous studies. And so what we found is that in most of the situations, combining these previously published models will give us better predictions. So that's what we see here basically. So here we found that with the different models, so each model had some predictive accuracy, and some of them were better than others, clearly, which are the red bars. You can see the C-statistic of the different models. So you can see some models perform better than others in our data. If we develop a model in our own data and use that model to our patients, it performs usually even better than the previously predicted models. But if we combine our data with the existing models, it gives us the best predictions. A third option is, so I mentioned this, is that we can consider the use of existing models. So if I want to predict cardiovascular disease, I could start using the Framingham risk score, or maybe the score equations, or the pooled cohort equations, I think are more recent these days. And for these models, there is already numerous validations out there, so that by summarizing all these studies or all their results, I can try to understand what performance of the Euroscore or of the Framingham can I expect in my patients. So will this model perform well? Will it give me my accurate predictions? Will it discriminate well between these different patients? And so by doing meta-analysis of all previously published validation studies, I can try to understand in what type of patients the Euroscore or the Framingham or any other type of model will most likely perform well. And just to better understand, should I use this model in my patients, or maybe should I do something else? So I would like to mention, so all these strategies are quite complex, and the methodology for this has not very extensively been evaluated yet, because they have been developed, these methods have been developed very recently, and some sort of validation studies of all this methodology are on the way out now. And so far, most of these studies have confirmed that indeed these evidence synthesis and meta-analysis strategies are very useful, notably when we have limited data at hand ourselves. So when we have huge amounts of data available, well, let's forget about what other people have done, because all the data that we have is most likely the most applicable to our own cases. But most of the time this is not the case. Most of the time you will not have plenty of data and plenty of resources. You will often have limitations in what you can do, and that's when it makes most sense and when it is most useful to start using what other people have done in your own analysis. However, so I would like to discuss now the opportunity of having big data, or I call it large data sets. And so what is big data? So, well, there are many people who have different definitions for big data. And I think in our research fields, in epidemiology, we consider big data in situations where either we are doing something like meta-analysis of individual participant data. So basically when we are combining our data with different researchers. So we set up a collaboration and we share patient-level data from multiple studies or from multiple countries or multiple settings, and have a very large data set with, I don't know, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of patients. Another situation also that is applicable here is that when we have access to large registry databases. So in the UK, they have, for instance, the UK PDS database with all patients with visiting primary care. They have follow-up information, etc. And also in Norway and I think Finland, they also have very large registry data sets that are used increasingly often for prediction modeling purposes. So these are all big data sets where we have a lot of opportunity to do more advanced modeling and more advanced prediction models. And so another example is the QRisk2 engine, which was developed using electronic healthcare data from a database with more than 1 million patients, which is also very large. And so what are the main opportunities of having these very large data sets and having these registry data sets? So we have so much data that we can do these more advanced prediction models where we incorporate many predictors and very complex relationships between all these predictors. So that's the kind of data sets where you can do this type of modeling. So this more advanced modeling has sometimes been done in small data sets, but most of the time it leads to problems. It leads to lack of generalizability. Another issue is that having these very large data sets gives us more information on more diverse type of patients. So we have more variability in all these different patients. So we have more data to try to explain why the outcome in one patient is different from another patient, even though they look very similar. And so basically we can investigate more complex relationships. But also during the validation of these models, we can do much more advanced things. So rather than just apply the model and see how well it performs, we can really try to understand how well does this prediction model perform across different types of patients, across different settings, how generalizable is it when we develop a model and start applying it from location to location, from setting to setting, from high-risk patients to low-risk patients, etc. And we can really try to understand what are modifiers of prediction model performance and what are key parameters that should be considered when we try to implement this model in new settings. And so, so the concept of meta-analysis becomes really important in these big data sets because often these data are collected from, there's some clustering, we would say as statisticians. So these data are collected from different locations, patients with different healthcare practitioners, different studies, different measurement methods, etc. So often there will be substantial differences in all these data sets. And this means that when we develop a prediction model, well, in the past people would just stack all the data, make one big pile of all the data from all these different locations and do whatever they used to do with a single data set. And then hope for the best that the model will perform. However, so in practice we see that this is not always the most sensible strategy because all these patients from all these studies will be different. They will be having a different maybe treatment standards. There might be different ways of how these predictors were measured, etc. And so basically, one global prediction model for all these different data sets might not always be a sensible thing to do. And so having these multiple data sets actually allows us to investigate whether it makes any sense to combine all this data from all these researchers to develop one prediction model. And we can try to investigate whether these prediction models are actually generalizable across all these different settings, and to what extent it will give us reliable predictions when we apply that model in new patients. And that's where we propose a strategy that has been discussed a couple of years ago, but it's called internal external cross validation. So it's a form of validation integrated with development that allows you really to, while developing a prediction model, to understand if I use a certain strategy of developing my prediction model, how likely is this model going to give me accurate predictions when I apply it in new patients. And how it works is more or less like this. So let's say we have 4 data sets from 4 research groups, for instance. Well, what happens is we come up with a certain modeling strategy. So for instance, it could be that, okay, we are going to develop a prediction model with these 5 predictors, and we will, I don't know, categorize age, and we will model blood pressure as something like nonlinear. And then what happens is, so these 4 data sets, so we will take 3 of them and apply this modeling strategy. So we will develop our prediction model, and then we will use the remaining data set to see how that model performs. And then we will iterate this whole procedure. We will take 3 other data sets for development, do the whole thing again, and validate again in the remaining data set. And so we can do that whole strategy, in this case, 4 times. And so we will end up with 4 models and 4 validations, basically. And by summarizing this performance in these 4 validations, what we hope to see is that there is a consistency in performance, so that every time in these 4 validations we see that the model performs well, and that discrimination is good, calibration is good, etc. That's what we hope to see, because then it means that our strategy, regardless of which data sets we use, gives us consistent performance in a new data set. Now, of course, if this doesn't happen, it indicates that there is some important variation that we are not accounting for, and some important heterogeneity that we need to consider. This is just another illustration of how this internal-external cross-validation might look like. So this is a situation where we had 12 data sets. So 12 times we used 11 studies to develop a model, and the remaining study to validate. And we see here the calibration performance. What we see here is the predicted risk versus the observed risk. And so you see here in this particular case that there is some heterogeneity in performance, because most of the validations are quite good. So you see that predicted risks and observed risks are in agreement over the entire range of risk. But for some validations, there were some problems. So study 1, for instance, you see that the predictions are too high for most of the patients. And for study, let's say, well, we see the same for study 6 and for study 4, etc. So for instance, in this particular example, we developed a prediction model that's in a couple of populations will give us over prediction. So if I would use this strategy on all my data, I will know beforehand that if I use that model in a new general practice, I will have problems in some of these practices. I will overpredict the diagnosis of deep vein thrombosis. So this is important to know. And so this is again where the concept of meta-analysis comes into play, because we are validating this prediction model many, many times. We can actually do a meta-analysis of these performance estimates. So we can summarize the predicted performance of all the developed models and try to understand sources of heterogeneity, so why performance varies across setting to setting, and try to calculate what is the likelihood that this model will perform well in new settings. So we can really come up with probabilities that if I develop my model using all these 12 data sets, and I will use it in a new practice, well, how likely is it that the model will give me accurate predictions, or how likely is it that I will have at least a C-statistic or an area under the rough curve of 80%, let's say. So there's a lot of more advanced things that we can do by considering this type of meta-analysis methods. And so, yeah, in the past, I think 2-3 years, a lot of publications have come out on to illustrate all these potential advantages and how to do it, and the methodology, because even though there's many similarities, if you are familiar with intervention research and the assessment of efficacy of medical drugs and medical interventions. So often what they do in these studies, it's a trial, an RCT, randomized controlled trial, where you have 2 groups of patients, and one group gets the treatment, and another one gets, let's say, a placebo or a reference treatment, and then they come up with a relative risk or an odds ratio or something like that. And then with a meta-analysis, what you do is you try to find all these trials that have been done that compare this placebo versus the intervention of interest, and they try to come up with a summary estimate of the relative risk or odds ratio. So that's quite straightforward. But in prediction research, it's much more complicated, because we don't have randomization, first of all. Second of all, we're not interested in just relative risk, we're interested in absolute risk of individual patients. So there's a lot more that comes into play that makes it more advanced to do all these things. This is just another example. So this is again the Q-risk2 model. And so in the original paper, when they developed Q-risk, they just published an estimate of Q-risk2, the predicted performance in the whole 1 million patients, something like that. And so you saw something like, Q-risk2 performs quite well in those millions of patients, but that was it. And so what we did recently is that we applied this Q-risk2 model individually in all these practices that were used for development. And so to really see, does Q-risk2 risk equation, does it perform well consistently in all these healthcare settings in the UK? And so fortunately here you see that it actually does. So there are some exceptions, but the variation in discriminative ability of QS2 is quite consistent across the whole UK. So it basically confirms that, yes, the UK-PDS engine can be reliably used in the UK. Of course, we still know outside the UK, but the main intention was to be used inside the UK. So this is another thing we can consider, is that if we don't see this consistency, we can try to understand where this inconsistency is coming from. So we can try to understand why is the performance of a certain prediction model inconsistent across countries or across settings or across risk groups. And for that we need, again, to consider the meta-analysis methods. And some methods that we have developed in that regard is we can actually calculate combined probability, because in prediction modeling we're often interested not only in one quantity of prediction model performance like a C-statistic or an observed expected ratio, but we need to know many statistics to be sure and confirm that a certain prediction model is accurate. And so what we can do is use these meta-analysis principles to summarize the predicted performance of a certain model, to come up with summary estimates of a certain prediction model, discrimination performance, calibration performance, impact on patient outcomes, etc. And the inconsistency in all these different measures across studies and settings. And then we can actually combine all these different components of prediction model performance into one quantity that tells us what is the likelihood that my model will, in a new setting, fulfill all criteria of this performance estimate. So what's the likelihood that a certain prediction model will have good discrimination and good calibration and a positive impact in a new setting, given that we see that there is a lot of variability in predicted model performance across my studies. And so we illustrated this here with different modeling strategies. So we had a lot of patient-level data sets from collaboration, and we considered different strategies of combining all these data sets and dealing with this heterogeneity. So one of them was we allowed for heterogeneity in baseline risk in all these settings by somehow tailoring the intercept term of the prediction model to new settings. One of them was, again, the same idea, but then we would use the average intercept. So we basically have one common model for all these different data sets. And one was, again, a different one where we would use a prediction model with, again, different intercept terms for different countries or settings, where we would, to figure out which intercept to use in a new setting, we would compare the prevalence of the outcome in our settings. And so what we saw here is that in this particular example is that the best strategy was to basically to update or to tailor the model intercepts to the new setting to give us the most opportune performance in new settings. So basically there was some heterogeneity that we could not fully account for, but that we could at least acknowledge by saying, look, please use this prediction model, but be aware that if you want to use it in your patients, you need to have some limited data to update one of the parameters of the model to your data. And just updating that parameter will be sufficient to give you reliable predictions. So the other things I mentioned is that there are many sources of why you might see that performance of prediction model changes across settings. So it can be either that your model is wrong, so that the parameters of the model are not adequate, that the regression coefficients are incorrect or biased. But it could also be the case that the patients are different, so that your model is correct, but your patients are just different, the mixture of patients is different. And it's really crucial to distinguish between these two situations, because if you are applying a model to a new combination of patients, you might try to, you might be over-focusing on getting the bias away from your coefficients, but it will still give you poor discrimination simply because the mixture of the patients. So if you cannot distinguish between these two facts, you might get stuck in trying to correct things that are you cannot correct. So there is still more guidance on all these concepts is being published. I think I want to say that we're trying to facilitate all these methods that are kind of complex by providing software for these things. And so, we developed this R package, which is now integrating this concept like internal external consolidation. And we're currently also working on methods to facilitate the development of these prediction models. Because I mentioned that for this whole thing to work, you need to come up with a predefined strategy. You need to say, oh, I will use these predictors, I will use, I don't know, some nonlinear effect for these variables, and I will categorize this and this and that. So you need to, come up with an idea. I will model like that, and then let's see what happens. And if it doesn't work well, you have to start again. So that can be quite, that process can be quite time-consuming, and it's not very efficient. So we're now developing statistical software to automate this process of, identifying the best modeling strategy and come up with its own methods to identify, the best way of deciding on how to model certain predictors and deal with all these heterogeneities, so that you don't have to basically every time go back, apply internal external consolidation, see how your model performs, and then to go back and make some improvements and hope to see that it gets better. So this is basically still work in progress. Then the final thing I would like to touch upon very briefly is the concept of machine learning. So machine learning is actually strongly related to statistics. I'm not sure why people always like to use different terms, but what you can see is that, so I've been talking today a lot about regression, which is in the corner on the left, which is also seen as a component of machine learning. And maybe you're familiar with decision trees, it's also a component of machine learning. So these are all basically statistical methods to come up with risk predictions, to come up with a model that gives you risk predictions for individual patients. Maybe regularization, it's also a form of regression, it's a bit more advanced, a bit more refined. And so in machine learning, some people have come up with new methods that are not really based on statistical foundations, but they have been creative and they've come up with very different type of methods to come up with these prediction models. And some of them are actually strongly related to statistics, others are not. But in any case, so that all these methods are now increasingly often used. So if you've used Google, for instance, to do a search, Google is based to some extent on neural networks and deep learning. So it uses a very different mechanism to come up with predictions and give you the best suggestions for, finding, whatever you're looking for. And so many people are hopeful that, or they are quite optimistic about these methods, and they started using them as well in epidemiological research. So rather than using regression to develop their prediction model, they use something like a neural network, and they publish it and they say, look, I developed a neural network to predict cardiovascular disease. However, so what we've seen so far in the past few years is that often all these fancy machine learning methods, they don't really give us those improvements that we hoped for, that we saw with Google and maybe some other instances. And why this is often the case is that, well, first of all, we have a loss of transparency. So many of these models are it's like a black box, it's a computer with a lot of complex equations, and you have to put in your data of your patient, and some magic happens, and you get a prediction back. But you have no idea why the risk is 80% and how that relates to your patient. So why, what factors contributed to those 80%. So that makes it it really affects the credibility of these models. The other thing is that often when they are developed also, and we validate these models, we see that the performance gain is often disappointing. So often they perform quite similar to simple regression models. So the differences are quite small. And so why this often is the case, by the way, is that because in epidemiological research we're often restricted to our data set. So we often have limited data with, 1,000, maybe 10,000 patients. Most of the time it's simply not enough to get those advantages from machine learning methods. However, now we are, coming in a new era where data is being collected much more frequently and much more often, and we have often access to much larger data sets, especially with data registries and maybe all these wearable devices. So the appeal of machine learning methods is actually increasing, and I wouldn't be surprised that it might change over time, so that in the future these methods will actually offer a lot more advantages than they do at this point in time. And so some of the key strengths that these methods offer are that they can handle a very large number of predictors. So in situations where we have data from a lot of different input sources, like think for instance of all these patients wearing medical devices, or like these heart rate monitors, etc. So these kind of methods can easily deal with that type of data. And they can also model highly well, complex type of effects, so which is relevant, for instance, when you are dealing with imaging data or yeah, maybe also again continuous data that is being collected. And so some areas where these methods may, machine learning methods may become very effective are, well, first of all, the analysis of unstructured data, so like imaging data that I mentioned, which is often highly nonlinear and complex to analyze. So what we do now at the time, what we often do is we have some, let's say a radiologist or someone who interprets the scans. You know, he looks at the scan and he says, I see this, I see this, I see this. And he measures maybe some areas or something like that. And that data is then used for prediction models. But with machine learning, you know, those steps could basically be skipped. You could directly use this kind of neural networks or something like that to feed the scan, and it could, you know, extract whatever feature he thinks, or yeah, it thinks are relevant. Then we have high velocity data. So this is data which is being collected on a continuous stream. Like people who wear these devices that measure their heart rate and maybe their I don't know, blood pressure levels and things like that. So there's continuous data being collected, and that kind of data could also easily be analyzed with machine learning methods. And then finally, in the field of diagnosis, there are also some areas where these methods might offer a lot of opportunities. So this is still the future, but this is definitely an area that will also become more prominent over time, is my expectation. And so we will also be working in this research as well. So we'd like to end with some, well, with a general thought, or are there reasons to be optimistic? And I'd just like to put this graph here because you may remember that when there were the elections in the US, I think most of the polls or predictions that were being made indicated that well, Hillary Clinton would win the elections. But it turned out that most of these predictions were not very accurate at all. So you can just see, you know, what the impact or what can happen if your predictions are not reliable. People can get disappointed, but it can get a lot worse as well. Well, thank you for your attention.
Great, so we have a few minutes for questions. Joe?
So I can't invite you here and not ask you a question, right?